On the 28th of January, 1547, Henry VIII, 55 years of age, died a miserable death after years of health problems which had only served to increase the depths of Henry's tyranny. Henry was a complex man. He was in no doubt as to the standing of his royal dignity. In 1530, in the midst of his struggle to be rid of his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, Henry wrote a letter to one William Bennet, saying, "We are not only prince and king, but set on such a pinnacle of dignity that we know of no superior on earth." In Henry's mind, no mere pope was going to tell him what to do. And even as a young king, still in his 20s, Henry viewed himself as being one of the great rulers in Christendom. In 1519, on the death of the Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian I, Henry seriously considered making himself a candidate to be elected the new emperor, rivaling his French counterpart, Francis I. The election as emperor never came to pass for either Henry or Francis, as it was Charles I of Spain who was elected as emperor instead, as Charles V. However, below the surface, Henry was a man with a fragile ego. During his courtship of Anne Boleyn, Henry, in a series of letters, practically begged Anne to reveal her feelings for him. Anne sensed her hold that she held over the king and strung him along nicely, choosing her words and actions carefully. But Anne had played a dangerous game with Henry during those days, and come 1536, when Anne's world would come crashing down around her ears, she may have thought about those earlier days when Henry had been so eager to win her heart. The king himself would also have thought about those days as well, when Anne seemed to disregard his high emotions and the passion that Henry held for her. Now that Anne had betrayed him, as Henry viewed it, the king would now discard her in turn, albeit in much more violent fashion. Even on a superficial level, Henry's ego was there for all to see. When Henry heard about Francis I becoming King of France in 1515, the English king made all sorts of inquiries to a Venetian ambassador, demanding to know almost everything that the ambassador knew about Francis. Henry even wanted to know the state of the French king's calves, and Henry even bared his own legs to the ambassador in order to make a comparison. Such insecurity in a king was hardly a becoming quality, and Henry's final years, dogged by his various ailments, would surely have been tortuous for this extraordinary man. Tall, strong, powerful, handsome, and vigorous as he had been in his younger years, Henry grew into a morbidly obese, wretched old tyrant in his 40s and 50s. In 1537, Henry wrote a letter to Thomas Howard, Duke of Norfolk. In the letter, the king wrote, "To be frank with you, which you must keep to yourself, a humour has fallen into our legs, and our physicians advise us to not go so far in the heat of the year, i.e., the summer." For Henry, still a man with visions of resurrecting England's glory days during the Hundred Years' War under the likes of Edward III and Henry V, the fact he could be restricted in his movements was not only hugely frustrating, but also highly embarrassing. This he made clear to the Duke by demanding he keep the information to himself. Henry's legs would bother him for the rest of his life, although not enough to dissuade him from continuing to campaign in France. By 1546, Henry's mobility had become extremely limited. It was recorded that two chairs were purchased for the King's Majesty to sit in and to be carried to and fro in his galleries and chambers. These trams, as they were called, can be compared to a modern wheelchair. During the trial of Henry Howard, son of the Duke of Norfolk, who had been accused of treason, a very unflattering portrayal of the king's physical state was given. The king was much grown of his body, and that he could not go up and down stairs, and was let up and down by a device, and that his majesty was sickly and could not long endure. Very public humiliations would hardly have done much to relieve Henry's ill humour, with his inability to endure, striking at a particularly personal area that had played such a prominent role in Henry's reign. In the weeks and months leading up to his death, Henry would have been literally pulled here, there, and everywhere, with all manners of contraptions devised to move him about. Dignity for the old tyrant was now long gone, but still, in the shape of his final wife, Catherine Parr, Henry had a queen who was compassionate and brought him some comfort in his final days. But it says something of Henry's character that even this final marriage very nearly went wrong, despite the fact its main purpose was to console the old king. We'll leave the final words of Henry's story to the man himself with this extract taken from his will. Our own body is to be interred in the choir of our College of Windsor, midway between the stalls and the high altar, and there to be made and set an honourable tomb for our bones to rest in which we'll also see that the bones of our true and loving wife, Queen Jane, be put also. This reveals Henry's mindset as his end drew near. Through his own trials and tribulations, and the endless suffering he had caused on countless others, Henry's heart and mind had never deviated from what had been most dear to him, his dynastic ambitions. It had been Jane who had given Henry his cherished son, Edward, and the dying king hoped that Edward would secure the Tudor dynasty for perhaps centuries to come and establish Henry's greatness. Greatness in inverted commas. Finally, the question we must ask ourselves is what brought about the tyranny of Henry VIII? Was it the jousting accident of 1536 and a possible brain injury that resulted? Tragically, Anne Boleyn, Henry's queen at the time, shortly afterwards miscarried, and the baby was evidently male. Did this tip Henry over the edge? It's quite possible. I also think the frustrations that Henry had to endure had proved too much to bear for a man who had an enormous sense of self worth, even for a king. Henry viewed himself as a big player on the European stage as he tried to place himself in the thick of the politics of Francis I and Charles V. Henry was a big deal, although not as big a deal as he thought. His physical decline after the accident would have been a great shock to the man, and questions over his sexual prowess would hardly have lightened his mood. But the truth is that there was always a monster lurking inside Henry, even in the early days of his kingship, and over time that monster would roar ever louder.